presentation is about the G7 in Germany and Citizen Climate International's work and how that, the past and what we could be doing in the future. Here's the agenda. I'm going to do a COP26 recap from a CCI perspective, talk about Canada and climate income. We're going to look ahead into 2022 and talk about G7, Germany, and climate, and then get into just a few acronyms within the G7 civil society and other G7 acronyms, and then have a Q&A session. So before I start, I just would like to know in the chat how hopeful you are post-COP. I'm just gonna stop sharing for a moment. And so 1 star is blah, blah, blah. 2 stars is okay, and 3 stars, I'm hopeful. So I'm gonna give you mine. Oh, there we go, we got some 2s. I'm not gonna give you mine then. Cool, you got it started. 2, 2, 2. Okay, we've got some thinkers in the group. No blah, blah, blah so far. Oh, good. I love to see a blah, 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 because I certainly felt blah, blah, blah at COP. Okay, wonderful. Okay, is there any more before I continue? Okay, great. Thank you for your honesty. So, and I should be sharing my screen again. Okay, if you're feeling blah, blah, blah about COP, I don't blame you. I was there. COP26 reminded me of Charles Dickens' book, A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. If you were listening to some of the speeches by leaders of countries on the front lines, or listening to almost all the civil society groups that were speaking in the plenary session for the civil society on the last day, or if you were listening to the kids and how alarmed they were, yeah, it was emotionally exhausting. And like a lot of people were being negatively impacted by what was going on. But if you step back and look at what the UN is, it can't command 196 countries to follow rules. All it can do is bring us together and get us to work towards voluntary commitments. So this has been going on for 26 COPs and I guess 28 years now, or almost 30 years. And a foundation, I think, has been laid for climate action. The Powering Past Coal Alliance grew to 48 countries at COP. Yes, it does not include the USA, China, and India, but we have countries that are working on this. There's a whole bunch of farming stuff going on. The methane pledge, 105 nations pledged to cut their methane emissions by 30% by 2030. There was deeper and commitments to ending recommitment and doubling down on ending deforestation. Over 100 countries, 91% of the world's forest, and a commitment of $19.2 billion to go alongside it. There was some transportation stuff. For those of you that are, a little bit worried about the trading and in the Article 6.2 and 6.4, well, there's going to be like an integrity initiative that's going to be monitoring this. And then there's all this financial alliance stuff that was happening that's going to align like $130 trillion of finances to like financing the future. And thanks to James, Joe got into a carbon pricing leadership coalition event with my prime minister. And they discussed at great length climate income, border carbon adjustments, trade as enforcement, the floor price, and like other things. And look at who was in the room. My prime minister, the EU president, and I think Mark Carney, and IMF president, and WTO president, and this guy is like world champion cement guy who loves carbon pricing, okay? Great room, and they had the highest level discussion at COP about climate income and all these non-market mechanisms. But there was even more developments at COP. There's a whole bunch of things that Joe talks about. I'm not going to go into detail. We do support the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty at CCI. That's growing. China and the USA are working together, which is awesome. We've got countries that are saying they're going to get them, that they're not going to do oil and gas anymore. We've got the beginnings of that, just like we had the Powering Past Coal 4 years ago. The Glasgow Climate Pact, for the first time, an F word, the F word, fossil fuels, was included in a COP document. And I think the best speech at COP26 was the speech by Barbados Prime Minister Mia Mottley. And she practically demanded quantitative easing, to give countries for adaptation and loss and damage. It was just so awesome. If you want, I have never heard quantitative easing said at a COP. There's a COP26 health program. 50 countries are going to be working to make sure that their hospitals and healthcare systems are net zero. And that's 2 to 4% of greenhouse gas emissions in most countries. If you didn't know it, over 60 countries, their finance ministers belong to this alliance of finance ministers for climate. As well, they're being supported by what's called DREAM, which is a research institute that's supporting the work for finance ministers to decarbonize economies. And I think we're pushing downhill now. And this was probably the most hopeful statement I heard at COP26. I was in the finance ministers for climate meeting, some incredible minds in the room. And one economist said, progress on climate policy and the transformation of the economy will not be linear. So for those of us who are seeing this really, really slow progress of like how we're decarbonizing the economy, well, there's going to come a point when it's going to start to escalate, maybe even get exponential. So this gave me tremendous hope, but I'm not alone. Just last week or a week and a half ago in Bloomberg, it was published that it's not just the moral imperative of dumping fossil fuels anymore. It's a matter of financial health. The financial system is starting to shift. And then there's this really super wonky Nature article that came out last week. But if you look in really deeply, it says that the transformation of the economic system, energy systems are well underway. So yeah, we're pushing downhill now. Now we just got to make sure it goes in the right, keeps going downhill and that everyday people, get some of this. So now how hopeful are you? Let's see. Was there any change? Oh, I got a 3. Oh. Okay, got 1, 3, and all right, this is good. Thank you everyone for your honesty. This is wonderful. Share my screen again. Okay, I would like to say that we're still in an emergency and it's compounded by an income inequality problem. And I do want to echo a sentiment that was said, what the 1.5C goal is on life support. This could flatline if we're not careful. But looking at carbon pricing, for really to work, trade is at the heart of it, because that's what's making it hard for countries to truly decarbonize, because they will become economically uncompetitive. So trade is hugely important. And fragmentation of carbon pricing policy is impeding, and that should say progress, not process, but it's impeding the process too. But so all these patchwork of carbon pricing policy, we need what my prime minister called for, which was a standardized carbon pricing. And we need political courage and to elevate the conversation. And guess who's really good at making that happen? We are. We totally are. That being you, me, and I. So, okay, so that's COP26. And just as a review, this is the Canadian carbon pricing policy. So I'm going to drill down into carbon pricing. Canada had enacted a carbon pricing policy that began in 2019 at $20 a ton, and it's going up to $170 a ton by 2030. We, up until this year, got our rebates once a year in our income tax and could not see them. It depends on which province you're in, how much money you get. I live in Ontario, and Ontario and Manitoba have a lot more hydroelectricity compared to Saskatchewan and Alberta. So they have mostly a lot more coal. So we have a more decarbonized electricity grid, so we get less. 60% of families come out ahead. Greater than that, the rural people in our country get 10%. And next year, we're going to get probably about, here in Ontario, about $250 every 3 months in our bank accounts. And just for the record, it is revenue neutral, with 90% of the money returned to households and 10% returned to the municipalities, universities, schools, and hospitals. So this is one component of the carbon pricing policy, and it's in one bucket because this is the consumers. We need to adjust. We need to start decarbonizing our households. We have a separate system for our heavy industry, just kind of like it's kind of like cap and trade, but it's without a cap. It's called output-based pricing system. It has exemptions. It has a much lower price, but it does incentivize cleaner energy within the heavy industries like cement and steel and stuff like that. So, but we know that if we had an economy-wide carbon price that applied to heavy industry, we could like shoot past our Paris commitments, which are not very great, by the way, but at least it would take a huge chunk of carbon out of our economy if we could have border carbon adjustments. So we need that trade, and we need the USA and Europe and a few other countries alongside that to get working on border carbon adjustments with us. So that's what brings me here today. But does this really cut emissions? Is this really the best policy? I think the most compelling thing I ever saw was on On-Roads, which is a policy simulator, and you can go there and you can play with toggles and you can look at what happens when you adjust various things. So if you remove all the fossil fuel subsidies, you see they get a tiny little decrease in air pollutants and no change in temperature. If you maximize clean energy, giving subsidies to everything like renewables, energy efficiency, electrification of transport. Again, you only take 0.4 degrees off. These are important things to do, and as well as planting trees, but you only get 0.2 degrees off. But if you maximize carbon pricing, you can take a whole degree off if you did it across the planet, and that would that's what we're hoping for. It can't do it alone, but it is the biggest policy that, for cutting emissions that we have. And this was really cool. This was just published last week in Nature that you can protect the poor with a carbon tax. Basically, I don't know why they call it a carbon tax, but basically with climate income, and it will be possible to meet the 2-degree target while also increasing well-being, reducing inequality, and alleviating poverty. And this is why the richest 5 to 10% amongst us are, huge carbon consumers, and they can afford to pay, more for their carbon. And most of us would come out ahead. And lastly, climate income. If you ever, want to sit down with a politician who's really concerned about SDGs, or anybody concerned about SDGs, this is a wonderful exercise to do. You can actually say, how does climate income impact on all of these SDGs? And it does so in a positive way. So the year ahead, right now we're all thinking about the year behind, but starting in January, we make our plans. And then the year begins. There'll be the World Bank IMF spring meetings, and then there'll be the Carbon Pricing Leadership High-Level Assembly, and then there's just food things, and we're going to have a citizens forum, and then there's the International Climate Income Alliance, and then there's the UNFCCC stuff, and then CCL USA will have their conference, and then there'll be the UN General Assembly in September, and then more IMF and World Bank meetings in October, a food thing, and then there's COP27. But also happening is that the G7 is like the G7 countries meet from January to June, and the G20 usually meet from June to October, and then stuff is happening at the World Trade Organization overlaying that. So what is the G7? It's an informal group of 7 of the world's advanced economies: Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, the United States, and the European Union. And they get together to influence global trends and tackle pervasive and cross-cutting issues. They were developed in the early 1970s. Canada joined in 1976. They started pre-OPEC oil crisis in 1973. And historically, they don't do much, but they actually, during times of crisis, because they're there to influence pervasive problems, they do tend to do a little bit more. So yeah, that's it. And then lastly, before this was really cool to read about a week and a half ago. The parties forming Germany's prospective new government and their coalition presented on November 24th pledged that Germany will use its G7 presidency to establish climate partnerships along with an international climate club, which will be open to all countries. So the G7 in Germany is already signaling it's going to be climate focused. So what's our history with the G7? The G7 in 2018 was in Canada. So I went through the entire process here in Canada and joined the civil society meetings, which is a division of the G7 engagement with the public. And there's over 200 civil society groups from many sectors across the G7 countries. We meet regularly for about 3 or 4 months, and then divide off into subcommittees and come back with what we recommend to be in a final communique that goes up to the G7 presidency. But the C7, which is the civil society network, is not the only one. There's also the business 7, the labor 7, the science 7, the think tank 7. I actually got to go to be a W7 delegate at the G7 in Cornwall last year. And there's also the Youth 7 as well. James Collis and Jess Wilbur and I were C7 delegates in 2021, and we worked very hard behind the scenes. And here are some opportunities and pitfalls within the C7. It's an incredible networking opportunity. It's educational. It's educational for others who you're working with to learn more about carbon pricing, but it's also educational for you to learn like the focus and who are the leaders and what are they, of the various civil society groups out there. You'd be surprised who supports carbon pricing and in poverty in the health sector, which is in the civil society. That was awesome. And you get to influence politicians and other NGOs. So there are some pitfalls in that it is a consensus seeking process. So you have to listen really carefully and try to get the gist of what they're trying to achieve, and then try to figure out how carbon pricing might fit into that and how you can kind of work with others to get that in the final communique. And diplomacy is not the same as lobbying. This requires intense listening skills and sometimes just biting your tongue and not saying anything, just deep listening. And lastly, we did manage to get carbon pricing into the final communique of the C7. It's the almost final communique, but it went to the G7 and none of us were invited, and it got bumped out and they replaced it with fossil fuel subsidies. So there is a risk if you don't make it to the very final meeting. What you worked at may not actually go up to the presidencies, up to your leaders in the G7. So that is it. Before I ask the final question, are there any questions of you before I ask something of you all, because you're going to go into breakouts?
So anyone got anything they want to clarify from that or to expand on? Just stick a hand up.
Okay. All right.
I had one bit I wanted to clarify, which is one of the earlier slides that Kathy put up with the picture of all the people in that session. I've played that session over and a subsequent session that was run. And for me, it was one of the most exciting things I heard at COP26 were the likes of senior members of the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition, which includes a member of the Lords here in the UK who co-chairs, and Rachel Kite, who's been a long-term climate advocate at an international level, basically explicitly saying publicly that they believe from the CPLC's perspective, the G7 was the next major opportunity to create this viable consensus route forward on carbon pricing, in that they, much as Kathy said earlier on, there was nothing in the COP, given the UNFCCC's powers, that enables them to force 200 countries to do anything. It was really about the leadership of the major economic powers setting the pace and agreeing how to do it. And for me, that particular session was very compelling. Yes, John.
How do you assess the CPLC willing on promoting climate income? Because what I've heard and read of them, they're still very much fond of cap and trade. So that would maybe also explain why politicians like that, you know? They can still play at another level without being, doing the recycling part.
Do you want to take that, Kathy?
We both could take it. This is my perspective and my opinion. So it's just mine, okay? Not maybe CCI's. But I think I've heard Joe say that the CPLC doesn't get involved in politics, and it doesn't, it just coordinates things. So if you're getting a perception that it seems to be cap and trade focused, it might just be that that's what you're seeing. Because I've been to the CPLC events where we spend a whole afternoon just discussing, carbon pricing in general and stuff like that. So I don't think the CPLC per se is pro cap and trade. I just think some within that percolate that message up a lot. James?
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant question, John, particularly for us in Europe. The sense I got from watching the presentation I got to see is the primary people supporting cap and trade at this point is the EU. And that the CPLC approach to this is that any form of effective carbon pricing can become comparable. And what they don't want to do is get drawn into the pros and cons of direct carbon pricing versus cap and trade. When I read back the transcript for the session Kathy showed and listened to the one I watched, the broad messages that they are saying is that we know how to make carbon pricing work. And the key elements were you have to price a substantial amount of carbon in your economy. So carbon pricing coverage is a big deal. We know the EU is trying to go in that direction, extending coverage. The second element is that the pricing must rise. And the third bit that was made extremely clearly in both presentations is to get public support, you have to return revenue, at least in some significant proportion, to citizens. And they were staying with the principles rather than the detail of how you implement each point. So that was the sense I got, which put us in the usual position of, yeah, we'd rather they didn't use ETS, but given that that's a political given, let's make it as close to this as we can. So that was my take. Did that answer your question, John?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, both.
Welcome.
Any other questions at this point? Yeah, go on, Brigitte.
I like this presentation very much. Can we get it and can we use it for messaging, social media, etc.? Because I really think it's very, very good.
Thank you. Yes, you will get it.
Thanks.
Thank you. The same for me. It was very inspiring, and I would love to use it.
Links in the chat.
Thank you.
I'm assuming you'll have permission for it, but if it doesn't work, we'll sort that out later anyway for anybody who watches the recording or otherwise. Nice feedback for Kathy, because I know she put a lot of work in on that. Good job all round. Any more questions before we take this question into the breakouts for a few minutes? Okay, Kathy, do you want to frame the question?
Okay, let's make sure we all know what the question is and we're happy with it. Okay. So what are your thoughts about working within the G7 civil society network to help with your goals in 2022? Is that the question you want, James? Is that clear enough? Does anybody need clarification? And then we can discuss what breakout groups people would go into.
I think that question is broad enough. My experience with this group is they will take that question and apply it to what's relevant to them anyway. So I think it's good enough to set a context. There's a dozen of us on the call, so I'm suggesting we move into groups of 3 or 4. And really, that's quite a useful slide to leave up, because it gives you a sense of the different groups in there.
Yeah, so you can possibly join the C7 or the B7 or the L7 or the S7 or the T7 or the W7 or the Y7. You can spread yourselves out, trying to just get that carbon pricing message in there. I was in the W7 last year, just my brief experience with it. I was in over my head. I'm a climate activist, not a woman's expert. And I listened the whole time, but there was something that one of the keynotes said, is that trickle-down economics has never worked for women. And I know many within the social justice groups are resistance to carbon pricing. And I did not talk until I got this one moment where I just had to say it. And I said, I'm so proud to be here. And I just want to share this one thing. And I have to say it. I said, a carbon price is coming. And you can either get out ahead of it as women or get the old trickle-down economics thing again. And you know what happened? They reframed their final statement to the W7 to include like tax reform that is, that has gender considerations. So, you can make a difference. You may not get like explicit carbon pricing stated within it, but you can make a difference. So I just wanted to share that story. I hope you don't mind, because we have lots of time, but now we can break off into groups. Is that all right, James?